As the night fell and Onwa prepared to drink the water, he noticed something different. The air in the palace had a strange heaviness to it, and his body was already starting to feel the effects of the sun's lingering warmth. When he took the first sip of the water, the familiar taste was there, but there was a strange aftertaste, a bitter and a metallic tang that made him pause. He dismissed it at first, blaming his own weariness from the day's event. But as the nights were on, Onwa began to feel a strange heaviness in his chest. His head grew dizzy, and his limbs felt lead. He struggled to stay awake, but the darkness seemed close around him. The room began to spin, and for the first time in years, he felt the sharp grip of fear tightened in his chest. The water he had consumed so many times before, had been tampered with. As Onwa's vision blurred, Queen Sarah, who had been standing guard just outside his room, rushed in. She immediately saw the change in her son's condition, and her heart skipped a beat. "Onwa," she cried, rushing to his side. "What is happening to you?" But the prince, his face was pale and drenched in sweat. He could not answer. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his body trembled with the force of whatever poison had begun to course through his veins. The queen, desperate and afraid, called for the palace healers, but they too were at loss. Nothing seemed to work. The prince's life was slipping away with each passing moment. In the dead of the night, when all seemed lost, the king and the queen made a fateful decision to return to the moon goddess. The journey was one they had taken years ago, when they sought the goddess's help for a child. But this time, they were not seeking for a blessing, they were seeking for a miracle. Through the dense forest, they traveled, guided by the faint light of the stars above. The air was thick with the scent of the earth and rain, and a quiet rustle of the trees was the only sound they filled the air. When they arrived in the scared grove, they found the moon goddess waiting for them. Her form glowing softly in the darkness, a serene and ethereal presence. "What has happened?" the moon goddess asked, her voice carrying both sorrow and wisdom. "Why have you come again, King Odumeje? What has befallen your son?" The king, his heart was heavy with grief, explained what happened. "Great goddess, our son Onwa has been poisoned. He is slipping away before our own very eyes. Please, I beg of you, save him." The moon goddess's silver eyes glowed with sadness. "Your son's life is fragile, yes, but it is not beyond saving. There is a way to restore him, but it will require a very, very huge sacrifice." As King Odumeje and Queen Sarah stood before the moon goddess, their hearts weighed down by their son's condition. The air around them grew thick with anticipation. The goddess, serene and ageless, looked at them with a quiet understanding in her eyes. Her voice was soft yet filled with ancient wisdom. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air as she spoke. To restore Onwa's life, the moon goddess began. A maiden must offer the most sacred of sacrifices, a sacrifice of her womb. The one who loves him most must stay by his side through the long nights, singing to him, calling him back from the grip of death. Only true love can bring him back to life, and it must come from the one who has given herself fully to him, body and soul. Queen Sarah gasped, her heart trembling as she clutched the hem of her gown. "No, great goddess," she whispered. Her voice was filled with fear. "Surely there must be another way. A life, such a sacrifice is too much to ask." But the goddess' gaze was unwavering. "There is no other way, Sarah. To restore Onwa, the sacrifice must be made. The love of a maiden, a love unbroken, will bring him back to the land of the living. But she must lose her womb in the course of it." King Odumeje, his heart was heavy with the impossible choice. He turned to his wife. His face was filled with sorrow. "We have no choice, Sarah," he said, quietly. His voice was thick with emotions. "Our son cannot die. If this is the price, we must accept it." They knew what they had to do, but a choice still tore in their hearts. They had been blessed with a son, but it seemed that the spirit could now take something precious from them in return. As the queen looked into the goddess' ageless eyes, she turned to Onwa's chamber, where their son lay. His body was still and cold, gripped by an invisible force. They knew that there was only one person who could make the ultimate sacrifice. One person who had been beside Onwa since his childhood. It was Carol. Carol had been beside Onwa for years, hidden from the public eyes, but always present in the shadows. She had tended to him, watched him grow, and cared for him when others were unable to. They shared a bond that no one outside of the palace could understand. A bond forged not by titles or privilege, but something far stronger. Carol's love for Onwa had been silent at first, as if often is when two hearts are destined for one another, but separated by the boundaries of fate. She had loved him as a child, as a companion, and now she loved him as a woman, deeply and without any reservation. When she learnt that Onwa was gravely ill, poisoned by a dark force, she could not understand. Her heart shattered. She rushed to his side. Her hands were trembling as she held his cold form, whispering prayers and desperate pleas to the heaven. She knew what she had to do. The moon goddess' word echoed in her mind, the sacrifice. Only her love for Onwa could save him. And so, Carol, despite the fear that gripped her heart, she made the decision. She would give anything she had. She would stay beside him, singing to him throughout the night, offering the most sacred part of herself for his life to be restored. In the dead of the night, when the moon's light shone bright and the stars twinkled with ancient wisdom, Carol sat beside Onwa's lifeless form. Her heart ached as she gazed at his still body, the once vibrant prince now reduced to a fragile shell. She knew that if she did not succeed, Onwa would be lost forever, and she would not bear the thought of a life without him. The palace walls were silent, as if the kingdom held its breath. Carol began to sing. Her voice was soft, but full of passion. She sang to the prince, not only her voice, but with her soul. She sang of their memories together, of the love they had shared, of the dream they had whispered in the shadows of the night. Her song was a prayer, a plea for his life, for his return to her. She sang until her throat was raw, her tears flowing freely as she poured her heart into every note. As the night stretched on, the coldness of Onwa's body began to subside. The warmth of his skin returned, slow and steady, like the first rays of dawn touching the earth. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and his hands, once stiff with the cold grip of death, twitched ever so slightly. Carol's heart skipped a beat as she saw the first sign of life, but she did not stop singing. Her love for him had become the song, and the song would bring him back to her. As Carol sang her heart out, hours passing into the stillness of the night, a shadow watched from the edges of the garden. Nkechi had been watching the event unfold from the darkness of the palace. Her heart was filled with rage and bitterness. She had known that Onwa was in danger, but she had never anticipated Carol's sacrifice would actually work. The very idea of it filled her with disdain. How could Carol, a mere servant, take what could have been hers? Nkechi had been consumed with a jealousy for so long that she had not seen the consequences of her actions until it was too late. She had poisoned Onwa in an attempt to rid herself of the love that he shared with Carol. But the truth was, It was not love that had driven her at this point. It was something far darker. Her obsession with Onwa had turned her heart cold. She had become convinced that despite the years they had spent together, she was meant to be his bride. Onwa belonged to her and no one else, so she thought. But now, seeing Karo's devotion and miracles of Onwa's resurrection, Nkechi's heart twisted in fury. She had failed, and worse still, she had failed at a great cost. She had watched as the prince's life had begun to slowly taken from him, and now Karo had saved him with nothing more than her pure love. The injustice of it ate all away at her. As the moonlight reflected off the garden, Nkechi's thoughts turned darker, her heart filled with bitter determination. She would not be cast aside. She would have her revenge. In the days following, the palace mourned not just Onwa's near death, but also the loss of what had been cherished, a trust. When the truth came to light, when the courtiers and the queen discovered that it had been Nkechi who had poisoned the prince, there was an outcry that shook the very foundation of the kingdom. Nkechi was brought before the king and queen. Her face was pale with guilt, but still defiant in her eyes. She stood before them. Her hands were bounded by the guards, her head held high, despite the shame that clung to her like a second skin. How could you, Nkechi? Queen Sarah's voice choked with grief, but also with anger. How could you betray us like this? You were a part of our family. You helped raise Onwa, and yet you sought to destroy him. Nkechi's lips trembled, but she stood her ground. I loved him, she said quietly. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. I loved him, and he was never meant to be with her. Karo was nothing but a servant, a shadow in his life. I was meant to be his queen. Her words stung like a lash, but the queen, though heartbroken, remained composed. You were never meant to be his queen, Nkechi. You have been consumed by your jealousy, and now you will pay the price. King Odumeje stepped forward. His face was solemn and resolute. You have betrayed not only my son, but also the entire kingdom, he said. His voice was steady. Your punishment is exile. Leave this kingdom and never return. Nkechi's face darkened, but she did not argue. She realized that she had lost. She realized that she had destroyed her own life with her own hands. Finally, her obsession had cost her everything. She had been driven away by the love twisted by darkness, and now she was left with nothing but the cold emptiness of her own actions. The days that follows Onwa's miraculous return were filled with joy, but also with an undercurrent of sorrow. The prince, although alive, was haunted by the near loss of his life and by the sacrifice Karo had made to bring him back. He could not forget the way her voice had called him back to life, the love that had pulled him back from the brink of death. Karo, her heart still heavy with the sacrifice she had made, stood by his side through it all. She had given herself to him, her body and her soul, but in return, she had received the prince's undying devotion. Their love, once hidden in the shadows, was now a light that could never be extinguished. Together, Onwa and Karo rebuilt their lives. Onwa, freed from the confines of the sun's touch, began to dream of a life where he would finally live in an open, where him and Karo could walk together side by side without the fear of what the world would bring. The kingdom too rejoiced in their love. The prince and his love for Karo were no longer confined to the shadows. They had overcome the darkness, and their love triumphed over it all. But as for Nkechi, her fate was sealed. She was banished from the kingdom. She wandered alone, a shadow of the woman she once was. Her heart was filled with love, was now consumed with regret, and she was left to live with the knowledge that her jealousy had destroyed everything. The days after Onwa's return from the death felt like a dream. For the first time in his life, he could feel the warmth of the world without fear, without the dread of the sun's touch. His limbs, once weakened from exposure to the sun, now felt stronger, and his heart beat with a newfound vigor. His world, which had been confined to the shadows, was now full of color, light, and hope. Carol, too, had been forever changed by the sacrifice she had made. Though the prince had been brought back to life, part of her had been left in the darkened room beside him, singing to him with all her heart. She had given a part of herself to him, something that could never be reclaimed, but her love for him remained unshaken and pure. In return, Onwa had vowed to be with her always, to cherish and to protect her all of his days. The kingdom too had changed. With Onwa's miraculous recovery, the people's spirit soared. They believed in the gods and in the power of love renewed. There were feasts, dances, and songs to celebrate the return of the prince. His story became a legend, a tale of devotion, sacrifice, and triumph that would be told for generations to come. But as the kingdom rejoiced, a darker truth lingered beneath the surface. Although Nkechi had been banished, the damage she had caused remained. The scars of her betrayal would not fade easily. The trust between the king and the queen, once unwavering, had been tasted to its limit. The love that had bound their family together had been strained by the actions of someone they had once considered part of their own. The tension between the king and the queen grew as their sorrow over Onwa's near death feasted beneath their smile. The guilt they both carried, the guilt of having placed their son's life in the hands of a dangerous and unknown force, remained a shadow over their joy. They had done what they thought was best for their son, but it had come at a price, and now, as Onwa stood before them, healthy and strong, they could not shake the feeling that they had narrowly avoided a tragedy that would have shattered their kingdom forever. Onwa, ever protective, noticed a subtle change in his parents' behavior. The warmth that once filled the royal chamber had been replaced with a quiet tension. Queen Sarah, who had always been so kind and gentle, now spent long hours in her private chambers. Her eyes were distant and troubled. King Odumeje too seemed consumed by an unseen burden, although he never spoke of it. Onwa could see the weight of his father's eyes, a weight that had nothing to do with the kingdom's prosperity or Onwa's recovery. The prince knew that his parents loved him, but he could not ignore the fact that they had been forced to make choices that had hurt them deeply. And though Onwa had returned to life, he was not the same man he had been before. The price of his resurrection had been a steep, not just for Karo, but for everyone involved. King Odumeje sat alone in his chambers one evening, his face lit by the flickering candlelight. The kingdom was thriving, the people were happy, and his son was alive. But still, the weight of what had transpired pressed heavily on his chest. He made a deal with the moon goddess, a deal that had changed the course of his family's history. But the question lingered, was it worth it? Would the kingdom have been better off without the risk? Could the price of saving Onwa, of putting his life in the hands of a divine power, had led to something worse? The king was not a man who often questioned his decision. He had ruled with wisdom and strength for years, earning the respect of his people and the loyalty of his cause. But this was different. This was not a decision made in council or war. So a decision that was made in the quiet of his heart, one that nearly cost him everything. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door, and Queen Sarah entered the room. Her face was pale, her eyes were weary from the weight of their shared guilt. Odumeje, she whispered, closing the door behind her. Are you well? You have been troubled of late. It is as if the joy of Onwa's return has not lifted the burden from your heart. The king sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his thoughts had finally become too much to bear. I worry for our kingdom, Sarah, for Onwa, for the decision we made. The queen walked to him, her soft hand resting on his arm. We did what we had to do. We saved him, Odumeje. We brought him back to us. But at what cost? The king murmured. We allowed ourselves to be swayed by fear. The prophecy, the goddess promise, it all feels so unnatural now. Was it worth it? Will Onwa ever be free from the shadow of the moon goddess? The queen took a seat beside him, her voice steady but filled with a deep sorrow. We cannot change what has already been done. We made the choices we thought were right, and now our son is with us. We must trust that the gods have a plan for him. He will grow, he will learn, and he will rule this kingdom. But he will never be free from what has happened to him. Neither will we. The king's eyes filled with unshed tears. I love him so much, Sarah, but I fear for what might be meant for his future. Will we ever be able to live a life without the fear of the sun, without the shadow of the goddess hanging over him? The queen's voice softened. Her eyes were filled with understanding. He will find his way, just as you did, and we will support him, but we must also trust him to carry the weight of his own destiny. Despite the undercurrent of tension within the royal family, Onwa's love for Karo remained unwavering. The bond they shared fought through the trials and tribulations of their life. They had only grown stronger with time. Yet, as the days passed and the kingdom jubilation began to quiet, Onwa found himself facing a new question. A question that had been shimmering in his heart for years. What was his future? He could no longer live in the shadows, unable to feel the warmth of the sun or the freedom that others enjoyed. But neither could he continue to rule in a kingdom that had been built in such fear and secrecy. He knew he had to find a way forward, not just for himself, but for the kingdom that relied on him. In the quiet of the palace garden, Onwa met Karo, his heart heavy with the burden of his thoughts. Karo, he said. His voice was low and contemplative. I have been thinking. She looked at him. Her eyes were filled with concern. What is it, Onwa? What troubles you? He took her hands, his fingers gently brushing hers. I can't live like this forever. We can't stay in the shadows, hiding from the world. I need to find a way to be free, to live my life without the fear of the sun. And I need you to help me do it. Karo's heart fluttered at his words, but she knew the weight of what he was asking. You know it's dangerous, Onwa. The rules, the cost, is not something we can just undo. I know, he said quietly, but I don't want to live in fear anymore. I want to live in the light, Karo. I want us to walk side by side, without the fear of the world or the gods. For the first time, Karo saw the depth of his longings. And though she was not scared, she knew she could not deny him. She too longed for the same freedom, the same future. Together, they would find a way to break the chains that bound Onwa to his past. The journey ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it was one that they were willing to face together. For their love, their commitment, and their dreams. For a free life. A life that was free from the grip of the shadow of the moon would carry them forward into a future that neither of them could yet see. But both of them believed it was possible to break free from the moon. The moon had always been Onwa's protector, its gentle light shielding him from the dangers of the sun. But as the days passed, his resolve grew stronger, and with it, his desire to break free from the shadows that had governed his life for so long. He could not continue to live as he had before, confined to the night, hidden from the world. The cost of this life had already been too great. In the stillness of the royal garden, as the sun set and the moon began to rise, Onwa and Caro stood together. The air was thick with a scent of blooming jasmine, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the evening breeze carried with the promise of change. Onwa's heart beat with both excitement and fear. The path he was about to take was uncertain, but it was a path that he had to follow. He could no longer wait for a future shaped by the rules of the past. He had to forge his own destiny. "I know the dangers, Caro," Onwa said. His voice was low yet resolute. "But I cannot continue to live like this anymore. I can't live in the shadows, always afraid of the sun and what it might do to me. I want to be free. I want to live as a man, not as a prisoner of the moon's light." Caro's hand tightened around his. She could feel the weight of his words, the depth of his longings for something more. "Onwa, you've been given a gift, a second chance at life. But I fear the cost of seeking more, of trying to break free from the rules of the moon goddess set for you. The consequences could be irreversible." Onwa turned to her. His eyes were filled with a quiet determination. "I know the risk, Caro, but this is only the chance I have. I can't stay in the shadows forever, afraid of what the world might do to me. I need to find a way to live without fear." Caro looked at him. Her heart was swelling with love for the prince who had been through so much. She had always known that Onwa's spirit was one that could not be contained by the rules set for him. And though her heart trembled at the thought of what might happen, she knew that she had to support him. Together, they would face whatever came. "I will stand by you, Onwa," Caro said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "If you are willing to take this step, then I will be there with you, no matter the cost." And so, with Caro by his side, Onwa made his decision. He would seek out the wisdom of the ancient elders, those who had knowledge of the gods and the ancient ways. Perhaps they could help him find a way to break the curse that bound him to the shadows, to give him the freedom that he desperately sought. The journey to find the elders was long and arduous. Onwa and Caro traveled far from the royal palace, through dense forests, across the rivers that glittered like silver in the moonlight. The land around them seemed to grow more wild and untamed as they ventured further from the kingdom, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and of the earth. They had arrived at an ancient temple, hidden deep in the forest, where the elders resided. The temple was built into the side of the great mountain, its stone walls withered with time, but still standing strong. The entrance was marked by an intricate carvings of animals, gods, and celestial beings, their eyes seeming to follow Onwa and Caro as they stepped into the sacred space. Inside the temple, the air was cool and heavy with incense, and the flickering light of candles cast long shadows into the walls. The elders, a group of wise men and women, sat in a circle, their eyes closed in a deep meditation. They had lived for centuries, guarding the knowledge of the gods and the mysteries of the world. Onwa approached them, his heart pounding in his chest. Caro stood by his side, her presence a quiet source of strength. When the elders opened their eyes, they looked at Onwa with a deep understanding that seemed to transcend time itself. They had known that he would come. "You seek freedom, Prince Onwa," one of the elders said. Her voice was soft, but filled with authority. "You seek to break the curse that binds you to the moon, to live in the light of day. But such a path is not done by one taken to be lightly. The gods do not give their blessings without a price." Onwa nodded. His voice was steady. "I know the risk. I have already lost so much, but I cannot live in the shadows anymore. I need to find a way to live in the light, to be free of this curse." The elder looked at him. Her gaze was piercing, as if she could see into the depths of his soul. "The path you seek is a dangerous one. The moon goddess had laid down the rules, and to break them is to defy the very nature of the world. But there is a way. Onwa's heart leapt with hope. Tell me what I must do. The elder continued. You will perform a sacred ritual, one that has not been performed in centuries. It is said that only the one who is born by the curse can break it. But in doing so, they must offer a part of themselves, something that can never be reclaimed. You must give up the very essence of your connection to the moon, your bond and its power. Onwa looked at her. His brow was furrowing. What do you mean? What must I give up? The elder's gaze softened. You must give up the power that the moon goddess granted you. The ability to walk in the shadows. The protection of the moon's light. You must let go of your immorality, your divine connection to the moon, and in doing so, you will become mortal, vulnerable to the world that exists under the sun. Onwa's heart sank. But if I do this, I will lose everything. My strength, my protection. I will be as fragile as anyone else. That is the price, the elder replied. The curse can only be broken by giving up the gift you were given. Once you do this, you will be free to live in the light. But you will also be as vulnerable as every other person in the world. Karo stood beside him. Her voice was steady. Is it worth it, Onwa? Will you give up everything for a chance to live freely in the light? Onwa looked into her eyes, his heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. He had always lived in the shadows, by the moon's protection, but now he realized that true freedom lays in the daylight, the warmth of the sun, and the world beyond the palace walls, and the life he could build without Karo. It was a risk, but it was the risk he had to take. I will do it, Onwa said. His voice was filled with conviction. I will give up my connection to the moon. I want to live freely with Karo, without the fear of the sun. The elder nodded. Her eyes were filled with ancient wisdom. Then the ritual must begin. Prepare yourself, Prince Onwa. The path you have chosen is fraught with peril, but if your heart is true, you will succeed. The ritual took place in the heart of the temple, where the moonlight shone through the opening of the stone ceilings, casting a silver beam onto the floor. Onwa stood at the center of the room, his heart pounding as the elders chanted ancient incantation. Karo stood by his side, her hands in his hands, offering him strength. The air in the temple grew heavy, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Onwa closed his eyes, focusing on the moon's light that had bathed him, the connection he had lived with for so long. He could feel it pulsing through him. The power, the immortality, it was everything he had ever known. And now, he was about to give it all up. With a deep breath, he whispered a prayer to the gods, to the moon goddess, who had granted him life. He knew that he was about to do was to change everything, but it was the only way he could break free. And as the last words of the ritual echoed in the temple, Onwa felt the power of the moon slip away from him, like a last breath of a dream. The pain was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as if the very essence of his being was being torn from him. The connection to the moon severed. His body trembled, and for a moment, he feared that he might not survive the ritual. But then, as quickly as the pain had come, it faded away. And Onwa felt a sense of release. The moon's power were gone, and he was free. When he opened his eyes, he saw Karo standing before him, her eyes filled with tears and relief of love. The ritual had worked. Onwa had been broken free from the curse that had bound him to the moon, and now, for the first time in his life, he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin without fear. The dawn was breaking over the horizon, the first rays of sunlight casting their golden glows over the land. For the first time in his life, Onwa stood in the light without fear, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, basking in its life-giving energy. The shadows that had governed his every step, the moonlight that had been his constant companion, were no longer his prison. He was free to live life as he chose, free to embrace the world with the woman he loved by his side. The moment was breathtaking, and Onwa could hardly believe it was real. He turned to Carol, who stood beside him. Her eyes were brimming with tears. She had been his rock through it all. Her love, her sacrifice, her unwavering belief in him had brought him here. Together, they had overcome every obstacle, and now they could finally step into the world as equals, as two people who had defied fate itself. "You did it, Onwa," Carol whispered, her love filled with awe. "You are free." Onwa smiled. His heart was swelling with emotions as he gazed at the woman who had stood by him through every trial. "No, Carol," he said. His voice was filled with gratitude. "We did it. We broke the chains together." The two of them stood hand in hand, gazing out at the world before them. The palace, the kingdom, the people were all part of Onwa's past, but his future lay beyond the walls of the palace and beyond the shadows of the moon. And with Carol by his side, he knew there was nothing they could not overcome. The news of Onwa's freedom spread quickly throughout the kingdom, and the people rejoiced. They had watched their prince grow and seen the strength in him, but they had never imagined that one day he would stand in the sunlight, living freely, without the weight of the curse hanging over him. King Odumeje and Queen Sarah, though had been hesitant at first, now saw the truth in Onwa's decision. Their son was no longer bound to the old ways, no longer constrained by the rules of the moon goddess. He had taken his destiny into his own hands, and the kingdom would follow his lead. The king, with pride in his heart, knew that his son was no longer a prisoner, but a true ruler, one who would lead the kingdom with compassion and strength to make difficult choices. The kingdom itself seemed to awaken with Onwa's new beginning. The people, inspired by the prince's courage, embraced the change that followed. No longer were they bound by superstition and fear. Onwa's decision to free himself from the curse had given them the strength to move forward into a new era. One they would live without fear, without hiding from the sun. It was a time of the renewal of growth in Enugu. The royal court was no longer a place of secrecy and shadow. Onwa and Carol, now officially untied in love and life, they began to forge a new path for the kingdom. Together, they ruled with kindness and wisdom, ensuring that every decision they made was in the best interest of the people. Onwa, having experienced the pain of living in shadows, made sure that his rules were one of transparency, honesty, and openness. His love for Carol and his desire to protect her, all those in his kingdom, drove every decision he made.